current world events and how they fit into the plan and the purpose of God. So our plan for tonight is, first of all, just look at this idea of God's mould or God's plan and purpose with the earth. And specifically, we want to look at some of the events that we expect to see in between now and when that plan is finalised. Then we'll look at some of the events that are occurring in our world today and see how they fit into that plan. And then finally, we'll just briefly touch on why this is relevant for us today. So let's start then by looking at God's mould, God's plan. We'll go right back to the start. And so if you opened your Bible right at the start, you would read that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So God created the earth, but why? Isaiah 45 tells us, "For thus says the Lord, who created the heavens, who is God, who formed the earth and made it, who has established it, who did not create it in vain, but formed it to be inhabited." So there we have the reason why God created in the first place. It was so that the earth could be inhabited. But it's not to be inhabited just by anybody. God's plan in Habakkuk 2 verse 14 says, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." So God created the earth. He created it to be inhabited, and He created it so that those inhabiting it would fill it with the knowledge of His glory. So in a nutshell, that's God's grand plan and purpose with the earth. Now the problem is when we look around us at the events that are occurring in the world today, we don't see the glory of God filling the earth. We don't see the knowledge of God prevalent in our society today. And so there's some pretty big changes that are going to happen in our world if we are to reach this point where the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will fill the earth. And so we expect to see some pretty big changes in between now and this state that's described here. But we can be certain of one thing, and that is that whatever happens, God is in absolute control of what's happening in the world as we see it. We're reminded of this in Daniel chapter 4, where it says that the Most High, that is God, rules in the kingdoms of men, gives it to whomever He will, and sets over it the lowest of men. So those ruling our world leaders, those governing powers are set up by God. And it's confirmed for us in Romans 13. "Let every soul be subject to governing authorities." Why? "For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God." So it means those world leaders, the authorities, the governing powers that make those decisions, God is controlling them so that His will is achieved. Now that doesn't mean necessarily that whoever is in power is the right person or the best person for that role, and it certainly doesn't mean that their decisions are morally correct and endorsed by God, but God is setting people up so that His will be done, so that they'll act in a certain way and the right people will be interacting so that His will is achieved in the earth. So we've said that there's a pretty big change that's going to have to happen to the earth if we're going to reach the society we have today to a state where the earth is filled with God's glory. And we have in Ezekiel chapter 38 a prophecy that really describes some of those events, and they're pretty significant and pretty terrible, but the events that are going to occur in the near future. So let's have a look at our reading, Ezekiel chapter 38. Hopefully we've still got that open there. So we see in Ezekiel 38, "The word of Yahweh came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal." So in those first couple of verses there, we have the description of a character named Gog. Gog is from Magog, and he's the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. So he's the prince of these other entities here, and Gog is the leader of them. But what's Gog going to do? Verse 4, "I will turn thee back and put hooks in thy jaws, and I'll bring thee forth and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armour, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. So what we have in this verse is an army. So Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, has this army that is behind him. Now it's not just Gog in this situation. Verse 5, Persia, Ethiopia and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters and all his bands, and many people with thee. So we can see this picture building. There's Gog as a leader of these nations. And then there's these other powers that are coming in behind him, and we're joining this great confederacy of nations. So what do these nations actually do then? Well, in verse 8, it describes the nation of Israel. After many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people. Against the mountains of Israel, there it is, which have always been waste, but is brought forth out of the nations, and they will dwell safely, all of them. And so what does Gog do? Verse 9, thou shalt ascend and come like a storm. Thou shalt be like a cloud to cover the land, thou and all thy bands, and many people with thee. So the picture that's built here is Gog with a massive army behind him, coming down into the land of Israel and invading like a storm, like a cloud. That's the picture we get from this prophecy. But why are we considering this prophecy at all? What has this got to do with us today? Well, there's two significant mentions in this chapter about the time period we're talking about. Verse 8 and verse 16, they both talk about the latter years. Now, this chapter, Ezekiel 38 verse 8, really defines for us what that time period is. Does anyone actually know when Ezekiel prophesied, or when Ezekiel lived roughly? Which is? Yeah, I think it's around 590 or something, 590 BC. So we're talking, 2,500 years ago that this prophecy was given. But Ezekiel speaks about the latter years, and it's defined in verse 8 as a time when Israel have been brought out of all the nations and brought back to their land. Now that only occurred in fairly recent history. After World War II in 1948, the Jews returned to their land and the state of Israel was established. So Ezekiel, even though he prophesied 2,500 years ago, is referring to a time period when Israel are back in their land. And so that is from 1948 onwards. Now we haven't seen this massive invasion yet. So this prophecy is going to occur, we believe, in the very near future. Okay, so we've got all these names identified. This chapter is talking about all these different countries that are coming together. Some of them we recognise, some of them we don't recognise, but we can be sure that it's occurring in our time. So let's now spend some time identifying these nations, because that'll become important when we look at what's happening in the world, in world events. So the first hints we get in both Ezekiel 38 and a parallel record in Daniel is that this power, the leading power, is from the far north of Israel. Now that really narrows it down quite substantially from the start. So north of Israel we've got countries like Ukraine and Syria or Russia. But we're not left in any doubt. And I'm going to flick through this fairly quickly because we don't have time to look at the details here, but Gog from the land of Magog is really a reference to a nation the Greeks called the Scythians. And you can see the extent there of the Scythian power. And it's really incorporating a lot of what today we call Russia. And there's Gesenius comments on this and basically says this Gog from Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, is really referring to the Russians. As does Bokar in his book here. He basically says Ross, the name we read, is the most ancient name under which history talks about Russia. So we can be fairly certain that what we're talking about here is a Russian-led invasion that comes down into Israel. And that's the regions we're talking about. When we're talking about this Gog, which is really the leader from Russia. Persia, Ethiopia and Libya, they're a little bit easier to identify because they're names we're more familiar with. Persia being Iran and Libya and Ethiopia with the names we recognise today. And some of those regions are probably a little bit broader than the clearly defined boundaries that we have today, if you're wondering about the shading there. There's also Togarmah and Gomer that are mentioned in verse 6. Now Togarmah has links to modern day Turkey. And when we look at Gomer, it's a little bit more difficult to pinpoint exactly, but the Cimmerians were originally driven down by the Scythians, and they spread out across Europe. And they're also known as the Gauls or the Celts or the Galati. And they spread and really encompassed much of Europe. So identifying Gomer really as the European powers. So if we put that picture together, we have this great confederacy of nations under the leadership of Russia coming down and invading Israel. There is some opposition though, and we didn't read it in our reading tonight, but in verse 13 we have Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and the young lions, which are really, when this invasion occurs, they kind of put up this protest and say, what are you doing? Why are you coming here? And identifying these nations, we've got Sheba and Dedan in the Arabian Peninsula, the Gulf states, and we've got Tarshish identified as Great Britain, and there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that Britain is what is being referred to when it mentions Tarshish. Now the young lions we identify as the Commonwealth states. They came out of Great Britain, and so we've got Canada, New Zealand, Australia, as well as America, most likely, who are a strong ally with Britain. So that's I guess the big picture that we can see. I probably won't spend too much time on this. This is really just the sequence of events of the invasion itself. So we've got this force coming down into Turkey, down into Israel, and that's when we get this protest. They continue into Egypt, and now the Allies react and gather at Jerusalem, and there's this great battle at Jerusalem in which Gog is victorious, and then that's when Christ intervenes. And so there's this picture of this massive conflict, but finally Christ intervenes and Christ defeats Gog and his forces. And that's when a new world order can finally be established. And it takes that shaking of the world to bring that about. So that's our picture from Ezekiel 38 of two kind of sides of this conflict. And we'll refer back to this map because what we're seeing in the nations at the moment is really interesting in relation to what Bible prophecy says will happen. So now let's look at some of the current events that are occurring at the moment in our world. And I'd have to mention at this point that I've got quite a lot of material from Andy Walton, who does the weekly World Watch. If you know what that is and you read it, then you probably know half of what's coming here. If you don't, it's probably something that you could look into because it's very interesting. You can subscribe and get weekly or updates every week or so on current events that fit in with Bible prophecy. But the first thing I want to talk about is Libya. Now, you probably remember back, it was quite some years ago now, when there was the conflict in Libya and there was the rebellion against Gaddafi, the leader at the time. And that conflict has been going on ever since. The US have come into that region, they've tried to stabilise it, but the conflicts have been ongoing and they still haven't been resolved. There's still civil unrest, civil war going on. But the interesting thing from Bible prophecy point of view is that all of a sudden Russia are starting to come in and influence this area. Russian special forces are apparently being deployed just in the western part of Egypt, right on the border to Libya. And the purpose they're saying is quite clear, that they're going to send these forces into Libya to assist this Libyan commander Haftar, who is leading one side of the civil unrest that's going on there. And the idea is to come in and really take control of what's going on in Libya. And I think, and there's a quote here which really links what Russia is doing to what's happening in Libya, and it says, "I think it's common knowledge, certainly in open press, the Russians and their desire to influence activities inside in Libya. The Russian and Haftar, I think the linkage is undeniable at this point in time." So there's a link there, but we might say, well, so what? Why does it matter if Russia are coming in and influencing what's happening in Libya? Well, that's not how the US see it. They see it as Russia coming in and basically undermining NATO and US influence in the Middle East. General Joseph Votel said, "In my view, they are trying to increase their influence in this critical part of the globe, in the Middle East. And they're taking advantage of basically the unrest that's happening to kind of seize control of this area, because whoever takes control of this area really controls the government of Libya." So after 5 years, the strife's still going on, but now Russia are becoming involved, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. Because if we come back to our map here, there's Libya, and we expect to see Libya aligning with Russia. So it's very interesting that Russia are now on the doorstep and trying to influence the government, really, of Libya. The next country I want to have a look at is Estonia. And this has come up just in the last week or so because the British troops are now deploying a whole lot of reinforcements into this area in Estonia. They've already sent 120 of their soldiers into the area, and in April this month they're going to send up to 800 different troops, and that includes I think it's 300 military vehicle or military equipment, including their battle tanks and artillery. So there's quite a lot of activity in this area. Apparently this is the largest kind of deployment they've done to Eastern Europe in the last, or in decades, this paper goes on to say. But I guess the background to this issue in Estonia is actually halfway through last year. In 2016, in July, NATO got together and they were very concerned about what Russia was doing. And this is not long after the incident in Ukraine, where Russia took control of Ukraine. And so they got together and they wanted to increase their military presence along the borders of Russia. And they agreed to the largest reinforcement in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland since the Cold War. So there's some movement happening here. Now, just to put it in context, so we're talking about these countries through here. We've got Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland. And so NATO troops, or NATO countries, which are highlighted in blue there, are sending reinforcements into this area here. And I've got a quote from that article back last year saying that they want to send 4,000 troops, all up, allied NATO troops, into this area. And the purpose of doing that is really to, or Sir Michael Fallon, the Defence Secretary, said it's in the face of an increasingly assertive Russia, NATO is stepping up its commitment to collective defence. So there's all these troops building up on that border. And I did think it was a little bit amusing that they're sending 4,000 troops to reinforce this area to face off against 330,000 Russian soldiers. So it may be more of a token move there, but there's certainly something going on in this area. Now again, coming back to our map, we expect these areas to be following Russia and under the influence of Russia when this invasion occurs. And so it's interesting that NATO think that these areas are at risk from Russian influence. So again, interesting in terms of our our map and what we expect to occur. Now, many people have heard about the Brexit. It's been all over the news. And this has come up recently because finally this Article 50 bill has been given royal assent by the Queen. And Andy Walton talks about this like, I guess, Britain are divorcing from the EU. And the first step in that process is really to have a good reason to separate, which is what the referendum was all about. So after getting that, the results of the referendum saying, yes, we want to leave, that triggered then something a bit more formal. And so this Article 50 is really like filing something in court to get that to proceed. So royal assent has now been given by the Queen, and it says there's nothing else stopping the formal proceeding or the formal proceedings to go ahead. And that since has happened just at the end of March there, March 30. The petition, or they're going ahead. The Prime Minister of Britain has now set that in motion, and as it says at the top, there's no turning back. Brexit is happening, and Britain are leaving the EU. And this has created a lot of concerns for both sides. Britain are currently the fifth largest economic power, and there's questions as to whether they'll remain in that kind of position. I think London is one of two major global financial centres of the world. But on the other side, the EU have been faced with the refugee crisis, with the debts of Greece, and so they're not in a particularly good position either. And as we'll see in a moment, they've met together to try and work out how they can pull everything back together. And I guess as Britain and the EU separate, there's I think they've got a 2-year period in which they can sort out all of the trade agreements, the assets, the liabilities that they had, and kind of make a bit of a clean break between that so they can start fresh and create new relationships and new trade agreements. Now, so why is this significant in terms of Bible prophecy? Well, you can see there that Britain is in blue. Britain are on the opposite side. They're part of the forces that protest when Russia comes and invades Israel. So it's not surprising to us from a Bible prophecy point of view that the British power would be separated from that of Europe. And that now is going ahead, and as it said, there's no turning back from that decision. There's a circle for you, in case you didn't know where Britain was. And as I said, meanwhile in the EU, there's been quite a lot of upset, and they've met just recently, coming back to Rome. They met with the Pope, and the purpose of this meeting was really to, now that Britain has left, after I think they joined in 1973, so after being with the EU so long, they're the first nation to leave it. And now there's concerns that some of these other powers might follow suit. France have their elections coming up, and depending on who gets in power, they may be in a position where they want to leave the EU as well. So there's quite a few concerns from that point of view. So they've come back and they've met in all places in the Vatican with the Pope, in the Sistine Chapel below the work of Michelangelo. And the purpose of this visit was to reinstate the unity that they once had. After 60 years since the original Treaty of Rome, they're coming back to try and unite and hold everything together. Now, this is interesting from a Bible prophecy point of view, because we know that in Revelation, the Pope or the papacy is referred to as the woman, and the European nations are referred to as the beast. And the woman would be riding the beast and basically controlling where it goes. And now here we have them all meeting together and trying to work out what Rome's decision would be and how they should proceed with the EU from here. So I thought that that was interesting from that point of view. We can't talk about current events without mentioning everyone's favourite character, and that is Donald Trump. So there's many things we could talk about, but as a candidate, Trump was pushing his opinion that they should seek friendlier relationships with Russia. And from our picture we've seen tonight, we expect to see the US and Russia on different sides of the final invasion. So coming together and bringing closer relations between Russia and US is not what we'd expect from Bible prophecy. But it seems like that was short-lived because, as the headline says, the honeymoon's over, and now all these problems are coming in, and the relations between Russia and the US are not looking as good as they could have. And so there's these, in particular at the moment, there's these questions about the US presidential elections and whether or not Russia hacked into the results there and affected it somehow in favour of Trump. And there's been some repercussions from that on both sides. There's also an event in Iraq where civilians were killed in an airstrike from Russia, and America have condemned that action. There was also anti-corruption demonstrations in Russia led by Putin critics, and the way Russia dealt with that and in detaining those people has been criticised by the US. So these arguments are starting to come up again, and the relations are not looking as good as they might have looked a few months ago. Now this spokesman from Russia has actually come out and said that the Russia-US relations may be even worse than the Cold War. So despite Donald Trump, it seems that the relations between these two countries are not getting better, and in fact are getting worse. And again, this is all about the arguments over the presidential elections, America's reaction in expelling some of those Russians that were involved or allegedly involved, and putting sanctions on different countries, including some Russian companies operating in Syria. Now finally, the last thing I want to look at is the Russian military build-up that's occurring at the moment. And you can see this is just in the middle of last month. So Russia, as it says, launched an unprecedented army drill in the Crimea area. Now that's the Crimean Peninsula that they took in 2014. And without any warning to anyone, they decided to run some of these army drills. And apparently this is the largest, or the first time the Russian army has engaged three large airborne units and simultaneously run these army drills. And of course, the reason for these drills was in response to an increased terror threat. So they saw the need to launch 2,500 paratroopers, 600 pieces of military equipment, and deploy that in Crimea just as a drill. So I think what we have here is Russia really flexing its muscles now that they have access to the Black Sea with their port in the Crimea. They're flexing their muscles and showing their military power there. I've got a quote in this article that says, since 2014, the Russian military activity in the Black Sea region has increased significantly. So Russia's wide-ranging military build-up in Crimea poses a challenge to regional stability as well as international security. So it's quite interesting to see Russia and the military build-up here, which is what we would expect to see with Russia at the head of this large military operation that comes down into Israel. So finally, I just want to briefly talk about how this is relevant to us today. We started our evening by saying that God had a plan with the earth. He has his purpose to fill it with the knowledge of his glory. And we've seen that God works in the nations. He works with the leaders of countries to achieve his will. And despite the terrible things that we've seen tonight, the invasion and the loss of life that will occur, there is hope for the future, because we can see the nations starting to align as we would expect from Bible prophecy. And so we can take comfort. In 2 Peter 1 verse 19, it says, "We have the prophetic word confirmed, which you do well to take heed as a light that shines in a dark place, until the day dawns and the morning star arises in your hearts." And so we can see that Bible prophecy has in part been confirmed. And in a world of darkness, in a world where there's chaos and unrest, it shines like a light, because we know that God is working to achieve his will. And the day will come when the morning star will, or the day will dawn and the morning star will rise. Luke 21 talks about a similar time period. And we won't look at all the detail there, but there's distress, there's perplexity, there's men's hearts failing for fear because they don't know what's happening in the world when they look around them and see current events. But we're told from this passage, when we see these things begin to happen, look up, lift up your heads, because your redemption draws nigh. There might be destruction and chaos, but out of it comes the return of Christ and the establishment of the kingdom on this earth. And so Zechariah 14 says, "And the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day it shall be, the Lord is one and his name one. The people shall dwell in it, and no longer shall there be utter destruction, but Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited." So there is a picture for the future where Jerusalem, the centre of war and chaos, will be safely inhabited. So there is hope for the future, and hopefully by looking at the current events that are occurring, we can be encouraged that God is in control of the earth and that his kingdom will soon be set up. So thank you.